good for me to have the opportunity to think about these things and try and put any part of this huge story together. So we'll go through our little contortions here. I go to share screen, right? I'm a slow learner.
That's okay. Well, I'm glad you reminded me because I have to push a little button to have you share it. So there you go.
Okay, cool. So can you see that?
Yes, beautiful.
Okay, so I'm going to then open the actual slideshow.
Excellent. There it is.
Just learned how to do that.
Great.
That little opening thing. I would have taken it out, but I couldn't. Anyhow, so yeah, wildflowers. The wildflowers are coming, as we like to say, in March. People have seen a few buttercups. Maybe some of you have. They are blooming in places in the Mid-How, and I'm sure if you're anywhere to lower latitude or lower elevation of sagebrush buttercups, if you're in this area, like Wenatchee, they're blooming there. So this is Shrubby Penstemon and Scarlet Gilia. This is on the road to Tiffany on the Boulder Creek Road. Many of you know that road. It's on a road cut of all things. It's on a road cut, and it's about halfway up there before you make that final turn to go up to Tiffany, where the road forks. And we're going to talk about these two plants actually a little later. I just liked this picture. So to begin with, I want to point out that for most of the history of the planet, there were no flowers. And that's an interesting thing that, initially there was no life, and we like this evolutionary story. That's part of what I think makes these subjects more interesting, is that there's a long, long history to any story about life that we would talk about, and certainly with ours. So let's see, if we put the 4.5 billion year history of the Earth into a year, then flowers appeared on December 31st. So they're brand new. Enjoy them. They're a new invention. And arguably they have they're well, not arguably, they're a highly successful form of plant life. And arguably they've taken over the planet, but that's not 100% true, because probably nearly half the weight of plants are flowering plants. There are almost 300,000 flowering plants, but the other half is mostly conifers, which cover the northern tier of the northern continents and weigh a lot. So new inventions don't necessarily take over the world, they just change it. So the next slide I want to prepare you for. The next slide is a 1-minute clip from a film called, I have to look here. How to Grow a Planet. It's a 3-part film series called How to Grow a Planet. It features a geologist named Ian Stewart. Some of you are probably familiar with Ian Stewart and some of you are not. He has some really great programs. Some of them are on YouTube and some of them are not. I could not find this, How to Grow a Planet. I could not find it available anywhere. Except it's for sale on Amazon for $10, but it's what do they call it? Area 2, Section 2. It's for Britain. It won't play on every computer. And I don't know if you know the trick. You can download a DVD cracker for free that cracks them open. You can do that. You can buy this thing for $10. It's really an excellent film series. 3 hours, 3 programs. The first is on the evolution of flowers. The second, no, the first is on photosynthesis. No flowers without photosynthesis. Second is on flowers, and the third is on the evolution of the grass family, which we're going to talk about. So, how to grow a planet. Ian is Scottish, and he has a heavy Scottish accent. So when he starts out, it's a little hard to understand him. It's just a minute long. I just love the way he starts this program, and I think all 3 start with this. But he's saying, as a geologist, I thought rocks explained everything about the Earth, but his accent's pretty heavy. But he's going to just show you something about the evolution of plants. It's just a wonderful 1-minute segment. Let's see if it plays properly. Whoops.
Unfortunately, you can't hear him.
Can't hear it?
No.
No
But
sound at all?
no, I mean, there's funny noises, but
Can you hear me when I
yes.
spoke over?
Yes, I can hear you right now. Not, were you talking over him?
At one point I said one thing.
Mm.
So let me just tell you, this is 1 minute long, and I don't know if I don't think I can skip ahead. But what he's going to show you, and I think it's worth, I don't know where we're going to be here. He's going to show you a seed about 20 seconds into it, and it's the seed of a Sequoia gigantea. It's the Sequoia tree, and he up in the Sierras, where the only place in the world the sequoias grow. The Sequoia tree is the largest organism on the planet and in the history of the planet. 2,000 tons, I remember, for the General Sherman tree. 4 million pounds, the heaviest thing that's ever existed. And how does it start? And that's what he's going to show you. So I'm sorry you can't hear it, and I don't, that's interesting that you can't. I'll have to work out that little bit of technology.
What does he have there, Dana?
So hopefully you got the image. That tiny seed, germinates into a Sequoia gigantea that grows into the largest living thing on the planet. We are talking about, extraordinary things that the more that they come through to us, I think the richer our lives are. So this could be a test from last week, or we could just call it a review. I have the flowers, like here's next one. I have some of the flowers we saw last week, just because it's nice to know names, and it's nice to recognize species. There's I forget exactly 11 or 12 species of buttercups in the Meadow, and you would never know it unless you start to learn to recognize the different species. So this is Sagebrush Buttercup, which is starting to bloom in the Meadow right now. And this little darling is Spring Beauty. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, most of you who live here. Very beautiful plant. That's the most beautiful one I've ever seen. And that particular flower is a variety that grows in California, actually. Arts don't get quite that colorful, but they almost do. Spring Beauties, Claytonia lanceolata. Did they change that name? I might have to Montia, I forget. Bluebells, these things all bloom right away in the Met House. In the next 2 weeks, these flowers will be blooming and are a great pleasure. This is yellow bells turning red because pudica, it's fritillaria pudica. Pudica means bashful. It had a little sexual tryst and is fertilized, and it's embarrassed about it, and it's turning red, and that's why it's called pudica, fritillarica pudica. Shooting stars. I remembered later in the week. So I said dodecatheon. That's the That's the scientific name. Well, maybe you say dodecathion. I was relieved when I ran into in the California flora, which is called the Jepson Manual. In the beginning, it says, it points out nobody knows how to pronounce ancient Latin, Old Latin. Nobody speaks Old Latin. So it says in the book, if somebody presumes to correct your pronunciation, just smile knowingly, because nobody knows how to pronounce these words. Is it dodecathion or is it dodecath? Larkspur. I mean, what a great creation. Look at that nectary, that spur that goes out behind that flower, which is to limit, obviously, the nectar is in the very back of that. So only creatures with long tongues, and I'm not sure who, I mean, certainly hummingbirds, although I don't know that I've seen that many hummingbirds at larkspurs, but moths, butterflies. But that's the idea, is these flowers are in a coevolutionary relationship with the animal kingdom. And these symbiotic relationships seem to improve the viability of organisms. So that's a wonderful phenomenon for us to take a bit of a lesson from. This is actually a picture of balsam root I took last year. I remember taking that picture at almost this time, probably like April 1st. And you can, so there were two bees on it on April 1st. It hadn't fully opened. That's why it has that faint, strange little folded quality to those rays, those petals. But you can get into bees, and people are starting to try and learn the bees as integral members of the ecosystem that we live in and pollinators for the flowers. This is, I call it wild carrot is what I most commonly call it. It's chocolate tips. Local people who've been here longer than I, which is now getting hard to do, but they call it chocolate tips. That's another common name for it. It is Lomatium diffusum. So it's in the carrot family. Look at those leaves. They look exactly like carrot leaves. This is our most common lupin, silky lupin, great flower. I showed a picture of it up close last week, but you have to push the flower open. If you look at a lupin flower with your lens, your loop, you cannot see any reproductive structures. The flower is all closed up, and that is to limit the who can reproduce it. These penstemons are not closed up. In fact, the opening is shaped exactly like the head of a bumblebee, and they are commonly pollinated by bumblebees. And this is a flower. This is the flowers. These are alder flowers, which are about to bloom. They're one of the first things to bloom in the madhouse, same time as the Sagebrush Buttercup. If I can walk on the snow today, I'll walk down there to my alder and see if they're blooming. But I know the catkins are elongating. They're wind pollinated. They're flowering plants, but they're wind pollinated. And look up above that male catkin, there's little dark red little spots. Those are the female reproductive structures, which are fun to know about and fun to see. This is a review, but I was reflecting on, my father told this good story about, he had a book on his bookshelf that he wanted to read for several years. And he finally got it down to read it, and it was all marked up with a highlighter. And he was so upset that somebody had highlighted his book. And then he remembered that he had read the book the year before. And unfortunately, that's the way it goes with information. There's so much information you cannot remember it. And I just have been reminding myself, look, it's okay to reread books. I think it's rich to have a flow of information and be reminded of things we've learned previously, because you cannot remember. It's not like we want to stuff our heads with information, but we do want to know about the world. Flower parts, sepals. Sepals covered the flower before it opened. When it was in bud, they spread out. Petals appear if there are petals. Windflower plants don't have petals. And then male and reproductive structures in the center. The thing about this classic design in this picture is there are almost 300,000 species of flowering plants, and they're all different. And that means that there's 300,000 variations on this theme. So you get to have the fun of trying to identify the flower parts. We talked about this phenomenon that came out of this evolutionary history, this book I have, The Evolutionary Biology of Plants. I see it over there. And he said he made this point. There are 8 monumental events. I mean, there might be 7, there might be 9. The thing is, life has had to, it's not easy to live on planet Earth, and life always has to overcome challenges. And even today, many challenges. So life had to, so we talked about these 4 last week. The origin of life, it remains a great mystery, really. The more you read about it, the more mysterious it is, because the most so-called simple cells on the planet, say a bacterial cell, which is so small, it's totally invisible, even to microscopes. You can't see them with microscopes. They're reputed to be as complex as a 737 airplane. They're just full of complex molecular structures. So life appeared. We don't know how. It's a mystery. It's a beautiful mystery. Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is underrated. All of the food on the planet comes from photosynthesizer plants, algae, and cyanobacteria that are making sugar out of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's just stunning that they do that. And how does it get into the plant? Through microscopic holes called stomata. Combined then with the hydrogen split off of water, oxygen's released into the atmosphere. Why? Because if the oxygen is put back with that sugar molecule, it pulls the sugar molecule apart and releases the energy that was captured in that sugar molecule. It's a totally, completely integrated cycle. And I object, these things are called, say, well, oxygen is given off as a waste product of photosynthesis. It's not a waste product. It's a unitary movement. Eukaryotic cells. Unfortunately, there's no way around the word eukaryote. Our cells are eukaryotic cells. They're 100 times larger than bacterial cells. They're a different kind of cell. And they emerge through symbiosis, through symbiotic relationship. One cell joined with another cell, probably tried to eat a smaller cell, bacterial cell, and they started to work together. It's a great analogy for the struggles on the planet right now between humans. Hey, maybe we could work together. Multicellularity. So bacteria are single-celled. Protists, which are eukaryotic cells, are single-celled. Multicellularity was an invention that came along a long ways down the evolutionary journey, probably a billion years ago, probably 2 billion years after life appeared. I think I have a slide about that, not next, but coming up. Anyhow, we'll see about that. Anyhow, there are these things, and so there's 4 more, and I've read about them, and I couldn't remember what they are. So you can guess. What do you think? What do you think great evolutionary advances to life are? I can't remember the next one, which is in the slideshow, and that is the ability to live on land. Life evolved in water. And we are something like 65 or 70% water, our bodies. We are walking bags of water. The ocean, life just got up out of the ocean and it's salt water. Our water is salty. Sorry, that phone is ringing. Won't last very long. So this is a glance at the plant kingdom. So, in the animal kingdom, they call the groups phyla, and in the plant kingdom, they tend to call them divisions. Sometimes they do call them phyla. Doesn't matter. But up at the top there, it says division name. And the division names are scientific names, and we don't tend to recognize them much. The bottom one says Magnoliophyta. Well, we recognize the word magnolia because it's a flowering plant, and I don't know quite where that came from. Plant. Phyta means plant. So the top word up there, chlorophyta. Chloro means green. That means green plant. You can break these things down and they're not so scary, and they're fun to learn about, but I actually don't remember what the rest of them mean. Green algae. It's commonly included with plants now because of DNA analysis shows a very close affinity with plants, green algae. And then there's, in this particular one, this is off of Wikipedia, this image, they have a second group of algae they call charophytes, charophyta, and includes stonewarts. And stonewarts are kind of interesting because we have them here in the Met-How, and they're very easy to see, but they're aquatic. They're in the lakes like peregrine. So these are the different groups of plants. Later on, I can show you roughly how many of these are in the Met-How for those of you who live in the Met-How, and it's interesting that no one's ever found a hornwort. Well, look, there's only 100 hornworts in the whole planet, and nobody's found one in the Met-How. At least they haven't showed it to me. And ginkgos. Look how many ginkgos there are in the world. One ginkgo. So, okay, so arguably, there are ginkgos in the Methow because fossil ginkgos have been found in the Winthrop sandstone that are 100 million years old. So they used to, well, actually, they didn't used to grow here because the Winthrop sandstone, which is halfway to Mazama at the Weeman Bridge, is sedimentary rock, but it was not laid down in the Methow. That's geology, so we can move on. So these are some of those divisions. Stonewarts, that was Charophyta, one of those green algae groups. It looks like a horsetail, but it lives in the water. Horsetails stand in water, but they have to come out of the water. I don't know of any horsetail that lives underwater. Stonewort lives in the water. It's in all the lakes, Peregrine, Buck Lake. If you look for it, you'll find it. Drop something down 5 feet or 10 feet and pull it up, and it'll be all tangled up with stoneworts. But the interesting thing about stoneworts is they look like a plant, and they were not considered plants 30 years ago, but because of DNA analysis, they're now considered to be plants. Two other groups in this image here, liverworts and club mosses. These are divisions. That's the genus. It's not the division under the word liverwort. That's the genus Barbillophosia. So a lot of liverworts actually are flat and lobed. And in the human imagination, they look a little bit like the lobes of a liver. And you know, the story was actually made up. And it shows you that the level of absurdity that the human mind easily gravitates towards. It was interpreted in the Book of Signatures in the 13th century that God was trying to talk to us, but God didn't speak English. And so God would leave messages that make these things that we're trying to, can't you understand that if you eat liverworts, they'll be good for your liver? That was the interpretation. I mean, it's like a fairy tale. We just live in fairy tales. And unfortunately, it still occurs. So that's where the name liverwort came from. But this other type of liverwort, a leafy liverwort, they are really quite beautiful. And they are very common in the Methow, but I'll tell you where they grow. They grow, you know, when you're hiking up a mountain trail and there's, or going through a mountain meadow and there's a stream and it has some dark green plant growing in the slow moving water or in the water dripping down over the rocks next to the fast running water. It looks like moss. It's a liverwort. It's a leafy liverwort, and you can pull a little piece out and look at it with your hand lens, and it'll look something like that. Club mosses. So the notable thing about club mosses is they grow upright. They learned how to create conducting tissue that could conduct nutrients and water upwards. Not only did they learn how to grow upright, but the largest fossil club mosses are 160 feet tall. I don't know of any club moss today that's more than 2 feet. They've been outcompeted in the atmosphere by stronger competitors, conifers and flowering plants, but they still exist. And I forget how many there are, a couple thousand club mosses, about 8 species in the Methow. So they do have a reproductive structure that looks like a club, and you can see it on that plant. So it was a great evolutionary advance to slowly evolve conducting tissue and to be able to grow upright. And it's partly competitive. If the plant could grow 3 inches tall, it would outcompete the algae that was only lying on the ground. So now looking at a few of our flowers, because this is actually what we're supposed to be talking about, is wildflowers. Shrubby Penstemon. We have, to my surprise, I counted up on the list, we have 13 species of penstemon in the Methow. They're not all native, but I think probably 11 of them are, and the others are really unusual to see, but they're around. So this Shrubby Penstemon is a stupendous plant that grows in large clumps on rocky outcrops and on road cuts. You can find it growing over, like there's a place on the Chewok where there's this wire fence to keep the hill from caving in on the Chewok Road, and the Shrubby Penstemon just cascades over that fence. It's beautiful. I mentioned last week, I think, penstemon, the word means 5 stamens, penstemon. And I like to say, and that's because they have 4 stamens. Well, penstemons have evolved. The 5th stamen has gone sterile, always in penstemons. And I think that's probably it on the lower lip of that drawing. That's, you know, it's not curled up, like the actual stamens. It's now serving a different function. It's not 100% known what the function of the sterile stamen is, and I think there looks so different in different penstemons, and there are several hundred species of penstemons in the West. It varies, but you can, once you know it's a penstemon, look for the sterile stamen and examine it and see if you can figure out how it works. Let's see, this was in the, many of you know this, I mean, it was fun to say, this was in the Scrophulariaceae figwort family, and it got booted out. I don't know how recently. The Scrophulariaceae got dynamited, and this actually got put in the plantain family of all the humiliations. I think Plantagenaceae, plantain family. I don't know why. Anyhow, but it's still penstemon. A lot of, that's the genus name, penstemon. A lot of genus names were changed to the great chagrin of older botanists. I suppose for younger botanists, they'll just learn the new names, but we have to relearn them all. And this is a good example. So Scarlet Gilia, many of you know this flower. It used to be Gilia aggregata. Now it's Ipomopsis aggregata. So the name got changed. Yeah, but the family didn't get changed. It's in the phlox family. I made a point last week of talking about characteristics of the family. I'm shying away from it because I can't remember them, but phlox family, fused petals, always fused petals. I think 5 or 10 stamens. I do have it written down here. 3 stigmas. You know, you start to get a feeling this looks like a phlox family plant, and it makes them easier to learn the name if you're looking them up in a wildflower book. Scarlet Gilia, very common in the Mid-How. It's a native plant. It's actually rather weedy. It grows on row cuts. That picture, the first picture that I showed was a row cut on the way to Tiffany, and Shrubby Penstemon is there too. And Shrubby Penstemon is also kind of weedy. And you know what that means? That means they make great garden plants, and it is the case. I have to beat the Scarlet Gilia back in my garden because it grows a foot tall, and I don't want it up high on the shorter plants that are up in front. I take it out. It is either a winter annual or a short-term perennial. I think it can be both. Winter annual means it germinates in the fall. And so I get these rosettes in the fall, and that's how I can take them out. So they're not there in the spring. But it's a great plant, and the hummingbirds love it. They come always to it in the summer. And another interesting aspect of it, so it's edible to wildlife, and the deer will chomp it down. And if the deer eat the main leader, the main shoot, it'll send up 5 shoots where there was 1. They'll be shorter, but they still might be a foot tall instead of a foot and 2 feet tall. So you end up with more flowers than you started out with. And so I go around now with scissors and cut off the lead shoot, and it makes 5 shoots instead of 1 shoot. It's just a tough plant, and Shrubby Penstemon is fairly tough as well. Anything else about this plant? So the new name, Ipomopsis. I had that name written down here. Oh yeah, there is more about it, and that is that it has had something like, it says 20 different. It's had 27 different species names because it varies so much throughout the West. So here's a white form I just pulled up in the upper left-hand corner. The red form is pollinated by hummingbirds, and the white form is pollinated by moths. And I don't think I've seen the white form. I don't know that we have it in the Mid-How. I'm not familiar with it. But it's interesting that the plant has that degree of variability, but it's still all considered one species. We have another plant like that, and I think it's the next picture. No, it's not. I'm thinking it's Surfberry. Surfberry comes up here, but it's got surprising variability. So waterleaf, ballhead waterleaf. So look at that scientific name, Hydrophylum or Hydrophylum. Hydro, we kind of recognize that. Water, phylum, leaf, waterleaf. The name means waterleaf. That's true for a lot of plants. It just means exactly what it means in the common name. Capitatum means capitate, round head, ball head. So the scientific name means the same thing as the common name, ballhead waterleaf. It's an early bloomer. I would say it blooms in the Mid-How in just slightly moister places than the shrub steppe. likes the shade of a conifer. This one interesting, well, two interesting things about this plant. One is it's called waterleaf. Though if you look at the leaf, the shape of the leaf, it will conduct water down to the roots. Any water that falls in that leaf is going to roll down the leaf into the stem and down to the root. And I was very impressed with that when I first learned that. But then if you start looking at other plants, a lot of plants do that. They conduct water right to the root, so it isn't wasted on the plant. It's very edible before it blooms. And a lot of plants, if the greens are edible, it's very edible before they bloom and they get bitter after they bloom. But these are quite good. I mean, they're mild, like almost like a lettuce leaf. You don't want to eat too many ballhead waterleaf. It's not super abundant in the meadow. But up in the mountains, there's one called Fendler's waterleaf that grows in mats that can be 50 feet wide. You could eat Fendler's waterleaf to your heart's content and not damage the population. So let's see. It's in the waterleaf family, Hydrophylasiae. All family names are made out of a genus name. In this case, it's made out of this genus. This genus is Hydrophyllum. The family is Hydrophylasiae. Trying to remember characteristics. You know, the most notable characteristic of the Hydrophylasiae is that the stamens are exserted. They stick out of the flower. You can see in that picture, they're sticking out of the flower. And it might be true of several other families, but at least you can gravitate towards the right group. You can check Hydrophylasiae in your book, Waterleaf family. I think the flowers are fused, and there would be some other characteristics. You have to look them up. Surfberries, more interesting than you would think. So for one thing, it's highly variable. And that may be why it has so many names, because we tend to call it serviceberry. I think some locals call it sarvisberry, which I think is just an accented serviceberry, Saskatoonberry, Juneberry, Shadberry, around the country. Well, why does it have so many names? I was surprised to read serviceberries in every state in the Union, naturally, except Hawaii. That's why it has so many common names, because it grows all over the country and it has different forms. There are different species. This is ours. Alnifolia means birch leaf, and the leaf does look like a birch leaf on ours. It's in the rose family. Roses have free petals. They aren't fused. Rose family, free petals. So you could do she loves me not, but you better start right, because they probably have 5 petals. So you want to, before you start in the right place. So it ends where you want it to end. Multiple stamens, 10 to 20 stamens in the rose family. They're probably offering. Why so many stamens? As we talked about in buttercups, which is not rose family, but they are similar in ways, rose family and buttercup family. They're offering pollen as food, as an enticement to pollinators. They offer nectar, but they also offer pollen. And pollen's a fairly high quality food that can be fed to larvae as they're growing. Well, so the one interesting thing about serviceberries is in the meadow, we have 2 distinct forms, and those forms show in the picture on the right. We have the form that grows tall, sort of like a fountain. It spreads out from the base to the top. It blooms before the smaller one, which is actually in that picture down low. You can see a plant in bloom. That's the other variety of serviceberry in the meadow. And I didn't notice it until George Wooten pointed it out to me. You know, I put a quote. I just sent the Next Naturalist to the printer, and I put a quote in the end there by Paul Ehrlich. He said, studies show that we see 1/1,000,000th, approximately 1/1,000,000th of the world around us. Well, that's why I never noticed there were 2 serviceberries. And if now that you know it, if you didn't know it and you're in the meadow, you'll see it, because this fountain-like serviceberry blooms for 2 weeks. The wind comes up, all the petals blow off the flower, and 2 days later, there's more serviceberries in blooms. They're just not as big. So George Wooten did take it upon himself to bring this up with the Burke Museum, the herbarium at the University of Washington, and he tried to make it into 2 species. But you just run into problems with serviceberries. There's so much variety in serviceberries, even in this species that I think they knew about it there and they weren't very interested. But it's interesting to see this variation locally. The petals, by the way, the flowers look different. The petals are much shorter in the second bloom. So I should not fail to say service berries are like manna in terms of food. If you're trying to live off the land, it may be the most abundant food source in the Methow Valley. I would guess that it is, because every year it produces a heavy crop of highly edible berries, service berries, that the native people, without fail, picked, gathered, and dried, and stored in bags, made out of tules for winter food. And you could gather hundreds and hundreds of pounds of service berries without fail. Also, I would say service berries, they grow in the shrub steppe, as you can see in that picture, very dry locations, but they've increased dramatically in my time in the Methow Valley. And I was thinking it was because of fire. What do you call it? Fire, putting out, not allowing fires to burn. But we had a fire. We had a fire here. I think it was, well, we had several fires. We had the Rising Eagle fire on the road between Winthrop and Twist that burned down 12 houses. And after the fire, the service berries bloomed like crazy. It didn't kill the service berries. So I'm not sure what's going on. But in April, you don't see these service berries. In April, when they bloom, entire hillsides turn white now in the Methow Valley, especially with the first larger species. So watch for service berries. Great plant. Monumental events. We had 4. This is number 5, the colonization of land. What do I know about that? If we turn the 4.5 billion year history of the world into a year, I would say plants appeared. I have it and I can't quite remember. I would say December 1st, the 12th month, towards the recent history, which is interesting that for most of the history of the planet, there's been no life on land. It dates to 400 million years, 400 million years out of 4.5 billion years. So life had to learn how to live on land, and it was not easy for life to do. Early colonizers probably was green algae, as shown in this picture. And what did life manage to do? Life, over time, managed to colonize land in this way. This is redwood tree. The redwood trees are the tallest organisms on the planet. What is it? I guess, did I put it here? No, I think almost 300 feet tall. So I put little numbers there cleverly so that I could look up number 12. No, almost 400 feet tall. There's one in Northern California that's 380 feet tall, a particular tree. I mean, there would be others that are 360 and 350. This one is just a little tall, but 380 feet tall. Now, by the way, that's not tallest by much. I remember reading about a eucalyptus tree that was measured at that height, and that tree blew over, so it no longer exists. But eucalyptus trees in Australia get gigantic. But we forget to be astonished that this is a life form that has colonized not just land, but the atmosphere. There was once life learned how to conduct water upwards, there was competition for light and also competition for not being eaten by herbivores. I just looked it up this morning, but the largest herbivores on the planet were dinosaurs that were 55 feet tall. Look at the branches on a redwood tree. They don't start until they're 100 feet tall. They co-evolved with dinosaurs. And these dinosaurs, most of the dinosaurs were herbivores. This 55-foot tall dinosaur was an herbivore. And mastodons ate conifers. I'm sure dinosaurs ate conifers. So there's always competition. There's competition among themselves for light and competition to not be eaten by a dinosaur. So they grew upwards. So the great mystery here is, how on earth is it possible to conduct water 380 feet up in the air? Because that's what happens in this tree. And there's no pump. These plants don't have any pump. All they have are tubes. So you can look that up on Google. But this is monumental to colonize the land. And so what are the challenges of living on land? Well, how about drying out? plants evolved in the water. And as I said, our bodies are about 65% water. We had to learn how to not dry out. And if you get dehydrated, you'll die. Same with a plant. If a plant gets dehydrated, it'll die. So it had to learn how to retain that water at the same time as being open to the atmosphere to exchange gases with the atmosphere. So it's a good trick, and plants learned how to do it. Cosmic radiation. There was no ozone layer. Ozone's made out of oxygen, O3, 3 atoms of oxygen. Well, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. Life could not come out on land. The ozone, the energy in cosmic radiation is so powerful that it destroys DNA molecules. So there had to be oxygen. So the first photosynthesizers were in the ocean. 50% of the oxygen in the atmosphere comes from the ocean. The other 50% comes from land plants. No oxygen in the atmosphere, no land plants. You have to have an ozone layer. It's a package deal. The evolutionary journey is a package deal. You can't go with what came before. So, a couple of belly flowers that I thought we shouldn't miss. This is Blue-eyed Mary on the left. I probably should have used a different picture because there's a bluebell in that picture on the right. But Blue-eyed Mary is a great little plant, but it only gets about 1/4 of an inch in size, the flower. It's a tiny little flower. We call them belly flowers because you have to get down your belly to enjoy them. And it always grows with another flower that didn't have a common name called Microsterus gracilis, which is a phlox. It looks like a phlox, but it's also minute. It didn't have a common name, so we named it Pink-eyed Larry. Blue-eyed Mary and Pink-eyed Larry grow together, and they're easy to miss, but they're at your feet often in the shrub steppe and not to be missed. And another good use for a hand lens, in fact, I think, no, I didn't put it in here. I've actually put a picture of a hand lens in here. Lyell's Mariposa lily. This is very common in the shrub steppe in the Met-Hal. But interestingly, it's a lot more common since the Carleton Complex fire. And it's increased dramatically in places it didn't burn. Explain that to me. And so what I think is going on, so let me mention first, for one thing, we have not talked about the fact that there are 2 major groups of flowering plants, monocots and dicots. And you remember that, and most of you would remember the rough sketch of what that means. But this is a monocot. The word comes from monocotyledon. So dicots are dicotyledons. The best example of a dicot is a bean. Cotyledons are seed leaves. A cotyledon is a seed leaf. A dicotyledon has 2 seed leaves. The plant comes up and there's 2 leaves hanging off the stem. Picture a bean germinating. The 2 halves of the bean are hanging on the stem. It's a dicot, dicotyledon. Monocots don't do that. They only have 1 seed leaf and it doesn't come up with a stem. But there's more differences. Monocotyledons monocots have flower parts in 3s. This has 3 sepals and 3 petals. It has 6 stamens and it has 3 stigmas. It follows the rules. It's a monocot. Dicots have flower parts mostly in 4s or 5s, probably some variation there, but I don't think ever 6s, ever 3s and 6s. Monocots have grass-like leaves and dicots have net veined leaves. And there's a big difference in the structure of the conducting tissue in the stem, which I can't remember very well, and we don't need to go into, but it's very different. They're clearly 2 evolutionary lines. I've looked this up online and never got totally clear on it. They say, what they always say in the evolutionary storybooks is flowers must have diverged into these 2 lines early in the evolutionary journey of flowers. No. These are 2 different evolutionary lines. They're completely different. Flowers must have evolved twice on the planet. I think that's pretty clear to me anyhow. So beautiful little flower. Why did it increase after the Carleton Complex fire? I think the smoke fertilized the ground. And so I was thinking, how could this flower that grows from a bulb and doesn't bloom the first year, it has to strengthen the bulb. How could it grow? How could it increase? And I realized that Those plants are there in the shrub steppe with their little grass-like leaves, but they don't bloom. They don't have the nutrients. Mostly they don't have the nutrients to bloom till you get a fire. And that smoke drops, I forget exactly what, probably phosphorus for sure, maybe nitrogen on the soil. And we had fields of hairy cat tears after the Carleton Complex fire. Notable purple glands they're on the sepals and the petals. And by the way, the sepals look a lot like the petals. And so with monocots, if they look the same, they're called tepals. I have no idea what the hair's about on those petals, but the purple glands are clearly assigned to pollinators because they're close to ultraviolet. Purple's close to ultraviolet. Insects see ultraviolet very well. We don't see it at all. That's just a signal to the image of how to find the nectar and how the insect is to orient itself to access the nectar, at which point it'll get rubbed by those stamens that are hanging there, and the flower will transfer the pollen, insect will get nectar. Highly edible plant, by the way, I mean totally edible. Unlike this one, which is poisonous. This is Death Camus. Most of you who live in the Meadow are familiar with this. It's deadly. I don't know how deadly it is. So reading about it, it said you would have to read, the information I wrote down here, I remember because I read it. So you have to read 2 to 6% of your body weight. It'll kill you. When I did the calculation, let's see, 5% of my body weight would be like, I forget, 5 pounds. I mean, who's going to eat 5 pounds of Death Camus? There is a story about a Navajo man in the 90s. I mean, they were making the point that it's deadly and people confuse it with other plants. And native people, they don't know many of them do not know as much about their native plants as they used to because of the damage done to their culture by invading cultures. So this guy ate some. He was out on a walk with his daughter and ate some. And it did not kill him, but he got quite sick. I think that'd probably be the most of the nature. I'm not going to experiment, but I'll tell you, the deer love it. If you find, so it comes up, see with these, it's a monocot. Look at those grass-like leaves in that picture. And the deer eat the leaves always in the spring. They're always nipped off before it flowers. So there's this one bee, this Sandrina bee, and I used that word last week, Sandrina bee. It looks a lot like a honeybee. It looks a little different, and you can learn to identify. I find that after looking at the pictures I have now of bees, I can kind of start to recognize some of the genera. Maybe I could recognize an Sandrina bee. Anyhow, there's this one bee, Sandrina bee. I didn't know this until putting this program together, that pollinizes Death Camus. And the other bees don't pollinize it because all parts of the plants are poisonous, including the pollen. Well, I don't know if that actually means that for bees, but they were making the point that this is the only bee that pollinates it. So it's something to watch for. When we hike up T for Twisp Hill on the outskirts of Twisp, some of you know that hill. It's, has a cross on it. We jokingly call it T for Twisp. It has a stupendous bloom of a very unusual lupin up there. Trying to remember the name of that lupin. It's Prairie Lupine. That's a common name, Prairie Lupine. It's a stubby, grows right down on the ground. I would say the end of April. Go up there at the end of April. But there's also a lot of Death Camus up there. Watch for this Sandrina bee. We'll all learn something. So we're talking somewhat about plants that are, last week was the very first plants to bloom. Bitterroot, that buttercup, which is now in bloom, was not in bloom last week and is in bloom this week. And we talked about balsam root last week. This is balsam root's replacement plant. It's called little sunflower. The scientific name Helianthella means little sunflower. Uniflora, one flower. There's one flower on a stem. This is a little bit like that serviceberry in that it blooms in almost the same habitat as the balsam root. It does like a little more water, just means it'll be down on the edges of the ravine maybe, but right next to balsam root. Balsam root starts to dry up. There might be balsam root back in the back there. I think it is on the upper left, I see those flowers are drying up. Anyhow, this blooms right when the balsam root dries up, and it's abundant. There's more of this than you would think. And like the surfberry, it took me years to notice there was a different plant. It doesn't look exactly like balsam root, but the flowers do. The leaves don't. Helianthella, it's a great little plant. I love it. And it assuages the mild pain of when the balsam roots start drying up and the season passes. Just to remind you, this is in the composite family called the aster family, Asteraceae, named after asters, which is a genus name. Used to be the composite family. Composite family is a good name because these flowers are composites of tiny flowers. And that's a drawing I pulled up that shows the disc flowers, tiny little flowers. What looks like a petal is a flower. You need your hand lens. Fringe cup. This is a flower that you don't always notice. It's smallish, not quite a foot tall, maybe 8 inches, but it's a cute little thing. And I suppose this illustrates the fact that there's always more to see. If you look closely, it turns out we have 3 species. If you don't look closely, it just looks like one because they all look the same, but they don't look the same. You know, the earth resolves. The more we look, the more there is. The more we look, the more there is. And that's really infinite. It never comes to an end. So we have these 3 species of fringe cup. Now, I like to say they have different names. These plants always have different common names. So Prairie Star, nice name, fringe cup. And I laughingly say, if it's growing in the open, it's Prairie Star. If it grows in the forest, it's Woodland Star. It's the same plant. And that's why you need to know the scientific name, except now you can't know the scientific name because they changed them. So this one on the upper left, for all the years I've been here, was Lithofragme Bulbifera, because it reproduces with asexual bulbs. And in this picture, this little red stuff, I don't know if you see the cursor, probably you do, those are asexual reproductive structures. And it may also pollinate, it does flower, but it reproduces asexually. You know, with nature, anything goes. And if asexual reproduction works, let's do it. So, but they changed the name to glabrum. In the new book, it's Lithofragme glabrum, and there is no bulbifera. Maybe somewhere else in the United States there's. Anyhow, these did not change. Parviflorum means small flowered, common name is small flowered. Slender, I don't know how slender it is. So I was interested to see, I've tried to learn this, I can never remember it, but if you look at the petals, well, Bulbifera, or the one on the upper left, glabrum, Bulbiferous fringe cup, it's red and it has bulbs on it. They're very small, but you can see them, and they're red. The bulbs are red. Stands out. Okay, you know that's Bulbiferous fringe cup. The 2 other ones, they have different shaped petals. Small flowered fringe cup has 3 bracts, 3, I forget what you call them. And slender fringe cup has 5 incisions on the petal. So it's just more to see and fun to realize. And when you see a fringe cup, you can try and figure out which one it is. Yes, fringe cups are in the Saxophrages family. So the word saxifrage means fragma, lithophragma. I think the word saxifrage means rock breaker. Saxicola. Sax means rock, fragma means fragment, break. Saxifraga. Lithophragma. Litho means rock, probably in Greek, as opposed to sax, is probably Latin. And it either means rock breaker, lithophragma, or it means rock fence. Anyhow, these things like rocky ground. Saxifrages, this is in the Saxifrage family. The way to tell Saxifrages is this drawing I pulled up in the upper right. Typically, so the Saxifrage family has 2 stigmas, 2 styles coming out of the ovary, and they often flare. They don't in this picture, but they often spread like this, and it becomes highly recognizable. Now, you can't see this probably at all in these fringe cups because the reproductive structures are a little bit tucked away, but in Saxifrages, you can see this, and it becomes quite the signal that you're looking at a plant in the Saxifrage family and possibly a saxifrage. It's a nice little sign of the Saxifrage family. This is a nice violet that grows in the shrub steppe. It will be blooming before too long. It's got a nice name, Valley Yellow Violet. I like that. Beautiful little creature. The lines on the petals are close to the ultraviolet, the purple. They're nectar guides. They're there to communicate to the pollinating insect how to reach the nectary. To my surprise, in the violets, the nectary is in a elongated bract that sticks out behind the flower. Wow, where did that come from? That is bizarre. I did not do that. So behind in the upper left picture, there's a side view, and you can see the nectary sticking out behind the violet. I didn't realize they had them, but that's going to, make it harder for some insects to pollinate it. It just limits who can pollinate it. I have no clock. Deirdre, what time is it? Seeds. I guess I didn't put in here the fact that this is another of the great evolutionary leaps. This is number 6 great evolutionary leap. There were plants for billions of years or millions of years before there were seeds. Seeds are an evolutionary advancement that over other forms of reproduction. And a lot of plants don't have seeds. If we go through that plant divisions, mosses, no seeds. Club mosses, no seeds. Liverworts, no seeds. Many of the other plants, no seeds. Seeds started with conifers. Conifers seeds are sexually reproduced, unlike spores. Those other plants have spores. They're sexually reproduced, which means they have more variety. They often are supplied with food. Look at that coconut. That's one seed. There's a lot of food there for the germinating seed. When it germinates, it can feed on that coconut meat for quite a long time. But not all plants have that endosperm. Not all plants have that food source supplied to the germinating ovary of the plant, because nature's into variety. And the best example of seeds that do not have endosperm are orchids, which are incredibly small. And if you're a seed without endosperm, it means that you have to germinate probably within 1 or 2 weeks after leaving the seed capsule. And that means you have to be in an environment that is conducive to germination. Well, where do orchids grow? Orchids grow in the tropics, where it's always wet. So they have the moisture they need, and they land on a substrate that they can germinate on, so they didn't need the endosperm. Coconuts, they probably float around in the ocean. It's a way of dispersal. Well, I put this in mainly for this line I'm about to pull up. That column is a column of plants that have seeds. So these are our old friends over there on the left: stonewarts, liverworts, hornworts, mosses. If you follow across, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down to ferns, no seeds. All the early plants did not have seeds. They may reproduce sexually, but they didn't produce seeds. They produced spores. Seeds were an evolutionary advancement because the DNA and the reproductive structure is really better guarded. It doesn't have to fall immediately in a friendly substrate, a friendly environment. It doesn't have to have water to germinate. It carries its own nutrients. And what does that mean? That means that plants can begin to colonize the uplands. It's part of the process of moving away from having to grow next to water or in wet environments. So the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 organisms there have seeds. There's a little more information in the middle of that. There's the number of species in the Methow, number of species in the world, the number of species in the Methow. And by the way, if you can go back to these things, and if you hit the button on your picture that says print screen, it'll print that. It'll make and you can if you have Photoshop or something, you can just put it into Photoshop and make a JPEG out of it. But for me, it's interesting to know how many horsetails are there. So actually, this is a little old, and horsetails have now been folded in with the ferns. Horsetails are considered to be ferns, interestingly enough. So that does date this particular little graphic. But anyhow, the main point here is seeds are a great evolutionary leap forward, and seed plants really comprise the bulk of the biomass on the planet, not just the plant kingdom. Most of the biomass on the planet are plants. If you think of trees, how heavy they are, most of those plants are seed plants. So it was very successful evolutionary strategy or natural selection phenomenon. So what's the advantage of seeds? Well, one is durability. This Silene plant, and we have a weedy Silene in the Medhow, a seed was found in permafrost in the Arctic, buried by ground squirrels, that was dated to 32,000 years old, and it germinated. I think spores last a long time, but they don't germinate. So that's another advantage of seeds, is they can wait for the proper environment, like for a scientist to dig them up after 30,000 years and put them in a pot and germinate. Not all seeds would live that long, by the way. Orchids live 2 weeks. Cottonwood seeds live 2 weeks. They have to fall on the proper substrate. I think cottonwood seeds are interestingly, they're like orchid seeds. They only live 2 weeks, and they have to fall on the viable substrate to grow. But when do cottonwoods put out their fluff? They put out their fluff on June 1st, when the rivers are subsiding and there's wet mud everywhere where those seeds fall. So they know what they're doing. So then I thought it was interesting, this Arenaria grows on Everest up at 20,000 feet. It's the highest flowering plant on the planet. And there's a moss that grows 1,000 feet higher on Everest. That was interesting to me. So,
Dana, it is 10 o'clock.
Thank you. Okay, we'll speed up. Grasses. Grasses are a family of flowering plants. They don't look like flowers because they're wind pollinated, but they are arguably the most successful plant family on the planet. These are 3 of our species. This shows you a little bit of the structure of plants. This is the flower. This is the flower. It doesn't look like a flower, but if you pull it apart with your hand lens, this is what you see, a little tiny little flower. In the middle is the ovary, and the little things that look like a bottle brush are stigmas to catch the pollen, and the longer devices hanging out, curving out, are anthers. It's a flower. They have flowers. They just don't have petals because you don't need to attract the wind. And this is why I encourage people to get hand lenses. This is a screenshot I took from widgetsupply.com. And I'm actually not trying to sell these things. I look at the lower right, it's $2 for the hand lens. They just have a good deal, widgetsupply.com. And I wanted to mention, if I were you, I would get either the upper left upper right up here. It says 18 millimeters. I would get the 18 millimeter, 10 power by 18 millimeter, or 10 power by 15 millimeter, only because this one down here, 21 millimeters, they just get clunky. They get big, and you're hanging around your neck, and you start to get a neck ache. So I recommend 10 by 18, and they're just so much fun, and it's a great way with kids. Kids enjoy them, although they always want to start fires with them. This is how successful grasses are. Grasses cover 40% of the Earth's land surface. They used to cover 20%, but they entered into a symbiotic relationship with an upright primate called Homo sapiens, and Homo sapiens have planted them all over the world. This is a little different story. These are diatoms blooming off the coast, that light turquoise blue color, diatoms off the coast of Alaska. Diatoms make their shells out of silica. Grass takes silica out of the environment and incorporate it into their stems and make it water soluble. And then when they die, the silica washes to the sea and feed the diatoms. It's a symbiotic relationship, and it is thought that diatoms have increased tremendously on the planet since the grass family took over the planet. And grass, why do I say that? Because the grass covers 40% of the Earth's atmosphere. We need to abbreviate this. Oh, but there is this. I just pull up Meadow Naturals. We had a story, how the evolution of grass changed the world. It's a great, wonderful story. It really is, but we don't have time to go into it. But this is Homo erectus learned to use fire. Grasses are fire evolved. Grasses had to compete with trees. How are you going to compete with a 380-foot redwood tree? Burn it down. That's how you compete with it. Grasses are co-evolved with fire. And grasses can burn and come back from the roots, or they don't kill the seeds of cheatgrass. Cheatgrass burns and the seeds don't die. I don't know why. They come back the next year. Grasses burned down the forest and created the savanna. Primates crawled out, came down, had to come down out of the trees because the forest burned down. And what evolved? Well, the genus Homo. Stood up on 2 feet, walked around in the grass, became Homo erectus. Homo erectus learned how to use fire. That led to the evolution of Homo sapiens, because our brain is the most energy intensive organ on the planet, and it needs calories beyond what you can get by chewing raw food. It's a product of fire. Really, the human brain is probably arguably a product of fire. Homo erectus, Homo sapiens learned how to use fire. It's co-evolutionary journey with grass. Human civilization is based on grass. It's based on wheat, rice, and corn. Some of you have heard about these Natufians. This name's come up enough that I've learned to recognize that name, Natufians. Natufians built stable villages, but they weren't agricultural. They were harvesting wild grass. The lower right is a picture of a sickle made out of an animal jawbone with flint blades entered into it so they could harvest this wild grass. There's a bread in the picture there. I don't fully get that because it looks leavened. Anyhow, it is the fact that learning to eat the product, that's the concentrated energy in the seeds of grasses, led to the rise of human civilization. So I bought this scythe right here, and I'm planting wheat, and this is wheat that I might be stuck here. This is wheat that I planted last year. It's so easy to grow. It's very difficult to harvest. I just wanted to show it because wheat is so beautiful. I just love it. And that scythe I just got, and I'm going to grow it again this year. I personally feel this attraction to wheat, and I realize it's part of the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens is wheat. This is the last slide, and I just want to bring it up because the willows are. This is a willow catkin. It's a female willow. Willows are. Every year I have to figure this out. Monoecious and dioecious. Dioecious means 2 homes. I think willows are dioecious. You can correct me in the chat if you want. 2 homes. They have male and female flowers on different trees. So this plant, this is a female catkin. Those are little ovaries there, numerous little ovaries, all lined up. All the pollen will come from a different tree. What did I want to say about this? Oh, the interesting thing about willows is, so this is a wind pollination design, but willows produce nectar at the base, a tiny amount of nectar at the base of every ovary. And the beauty of that for us is when the willows bloom, which is the first week of April on the valley floor, coming up here, insects come along to harvest that nectar. The insects are attracted to the catkins. Aphids lay eggs on the catkins, and then the ruby-crowned kinglets arrive. And so it sounds, the trees are just buzzing with activity and have that beautiful ruby-crowned kinglet song. So this is something to look forward to the first week of April, and something to watch for, and this interconnectivity of the plants and the insects and the birds all joined together. And I think that's the last slide. Just about like last week, went a few minutes overtime. Going back to that.
Very nice. Maybe we should just say it goes till 10:15.
Well, people can always bail.
That's true. A couple of people did. Great. Thank you, Dana. That was educational, entertaining, and fun to listen to. So great.
I'm going to look briefly at chat and see if, because we're overtime. Well, you can bail, obviously. Scarlet Gilia, is it a biennial? It's confusing. I would call it a short-term perennial only because sometimes I see it come back a second year.